What happens when the law, which is supposed to protect, becomes a tool of oppression? For Emily Caldwell, a respected professor of constitutional law, it all started with a seemingly trivial traffic violation. A small mistake, parking in the wrong place, landed her in the very place she had studied for years, a courtroom where justice is supposed to prevail. But what she witnessed that day made her question everything she thought she knew about the system she had spent her career analyzing. Judge Nathaniel Carter, her former star student. Today he is a high-ranking judge. But there is something wrong with the way he decides cases. The judge's demeanor, the way the room seems to quiet with each glance he gives. It's more than just the tension of a legal proceeding. No, there's something deeper, something more sinister going on. Why was the judge so quick to dismiss her case? Why did his tone change so dramatically when he spoke to her compared to the others in the room? Emily was no stranger to systemic bias, but this felt different. Could a simple parking ticket be the key to something much darker? Was this a stroke of luck or a sign of something much more troubling in the justice system? Let's find out today. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. Is it sunny or snowing where you are? If it's cold, make sure to bundle up, grab a cup of hot tea, and enjoy today's story with your loved ones. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories to come. Professor Emily Caldwell stepped out of her sleek, silver sedan and gazed up at the towering courthouse in front of her. The stone walls of the building, washed in the pale light of early morning, seemed to echo with the weight of countless legal battles fought and decided within. As a seasoned professor of constitutional law at Fairview University, Emily had never imagined she would find herself in this setting. Her work typically revolved around reviewing case law, conducting research on racial disparities in legal systems, and shaping young minds in lecture halls. Yet today, she wasn't in a classroom or library. She was about to witness a very different kind of justice unfold, a justice that she had come to study in theory but never expected to experience firsthand. Her hand gripped the strap of her leather briefcase, the weight of it strangely comforting. Emily straightened her navy blue blazer and adjusted the collar of her blouse as she took a deep breath, preparing for the day ahead. She had no intentions of engaging in the courtroom drama that often unfolded in these halls. No, she was here for something specific, something that had been bothering her for weeks. Recent complaints about racial biases in traffic citations had caught her attention, and she knew this was the perfect opportunity to observe how these disparities played out in real time. It was not an accident that Emily found herself in a traffic court this Monday morning. Her research had led her to believe that such cases were fertile ground for studying the subtler forms of discrimination that ran rampant through the system. As Emily stepped into the courthouse, the familiar sound of bustling activity surrounded her. Security guards greeting regulars with a wave, clerks hurriedly shuffling papers, and the soft murmur of nervous defendants whispering to their attorneys. Emily noted the little details, the human elements that made up the court's everyday atmosphere. The building smelled faintly of old wood and paper, a scent that clung to the air like a relic of a bygone era, a far cry from the sterile halls of academia, yet equally charged with the weight of history. She slowly made her way down the hallway, her heels clicking on the polished floors. Her eyes darted around, taking in the subtle gestures and body language of those in the waiting area. A young man, no older than 20, nervously adjusted his tie as he leaned over to speak with his attorney. A middle-aged woman sat across from him, clutching a stack of papers in her hands, her brow furrowed in worry. These were the faces of those most often affected by the blind spots in the justice system, the ones who didn't have the resources or the connections to mount a serious defense. Emily's gaze lingered on the faces of those around her. She was no stranger to the ways systemic bias could subtly influence decisions. The small gestures, the way people were treated based on their appearance, their background, their race, had been a part of her academic research for years. She could already see it happening before her eyes. One defendant, a black man in a hoodie, was greeted with a cold nod by the court clerk, while the white defendant next to him was greeted with a friendly handshake. It was subtle, but Emily had learned over the years that it was these seemingly insignificant moments that could have a profound impact on the outcome of a case. Taking her seat in the back row, Emily opened her briefcase and pulled out her notepad. Her pen hovered above the page as she began to observe. She was here to collect data, not for a research paper, but for something far more urgent. She knew that what she was witnessing was just the tip of the iceberg. Racial bias in traffic citations was nothing new, but it was difficult to quantify. Today, she hoped to see firsthand the subtle ways that bias played out in the court system and how the people on both sides of the bench navigated these complex dynamics. As the session began, the room filled with a mix of anticipation and unease. The defendants waited nervously for their turn, some fidgeting, others lost in their thoughts. Emily watched as a middle-aged woman in a business suit took her place at the front of the room. She was given a curt nod by the judge, her case briefly acknowledged before moving on to the next defendant. Emily couldn't help but notice how different the treatment was for her compared to the young man in the hoodie, who was interrupted mid-sentence and dismissed with barely a glance. Emily Caldwell sat quietly in the back row of the crowded courtroom, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She had witnessed the arrival of several defendants, some looking nervous, others resigned. The occasional shuffling of papers echoed through the chamber as attorneys prepared their cases. But what truly caught her attention was the young man now stepping up to the judge's bench. Judge Nathaniel Carter. At first glance, he appeared the typical image of a youthful, ambitious judge. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his crisp black robe billowed as he moved. His posture was upright, radiating confidence, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the subtle signs of someone eager to prove himself. She knew his reputation. A rising star in the legal community, known for his strict, no-nonsense approach to justice. But what Emily knew most of all, what stood out to her, was that Nathaniel Carter was once her student. Years ago, he had sat in her lecture hall at Fairview University, eager to soak in every word about constitutional law and the importance of equal justice. Emily remembered him well. His questions were always sharp, often challenging, but he seemed to thrive on debate. He had been one of her brightest students, and she had no doubt that he would go far in his career. After all, she had written him a glowing letter of recommendation that had helped propel him onto the fast track to a judicial appointment. But as she looked at him now, standing behind the bench with the authority of someone far older, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had changed. Gone was the curious, thoughtful student she had known. In his place was a judge who seemed eager to assert his power, someone who no longer seemed to carry the same commitment to fairness and equality that had once defined him. Emily shook off the thought. It was unfair to judge him based on an old memory, she reminded herself. Today, she was here as an observer, and she would keep her focus on the case at hand. The defendant before her, a middle-aged man in a faded suit, was nervously explaining how his car had been ticketed for parking in a restricted zone, a zone he claimed was poorly marked by overgrown branches. Emily had studied the case in advance. The signage was indeed difficult to read, and she had brought photographs to support the claim. When it was her turn, Emily stood up, gathering her materials and adjusting her blazer. As she approached the front of the courtroom, she felt the eyes of the room turn toward her. The usual quiet murmur of the courthouse faded, replaced by a sudden stillness. She was no stranger to being in the spotlight. After all, she had spent years teaching young legal minds and had delivered countless lectures. But here, standing before Judge Carter, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She glanced at him briefly and saw the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the cold, professional mask of a judge. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice calm and steady, "I am contesting a parking citation issued to me last month." The sign indicating the restricted parking zone was partially obscured by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. The courtroom was silent, and she could feel the weight of every eye on her. She opened her briefcase, retrieving the photographs she had taken, and placed them on the podium for the judge to see. They clearly showed the obstructed sign, the branches blocking the view of the key information. Emily continued, "As you can see, the sign was not clearly visible. This isn't a case of negligence on my part. It's a case of faulty signage, which should not be the responsibility of the driver to navigate." She looked up to meet Judge Carter's eyes, expecting him to examine the photographs carefully. Instead, what she saw was a man growing increasingly impatient, his jaw tightening. Without warning, he cut her off. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice sharp, "the officer's report clearly states that the sign was visible and the citation was issued within the proper parameters. Are you suggesting that the officer made an error?" Emily's breath caught slightly at the abruptness of his interruption. She had expected some pushback, but the tone of his voice caught her off guard. She had taught him better than this, hadn't she? The Nathaniel she had known would have listened to her argument with respect. The judge before her seemed less interested in fairness and more in asserting his authority. "No, Your Honor," Emily replied, maintaining her composure. "What I'm suggesting is that the officer may have missed the obstruction or failed to acknowledge the practical reality of the situation. These photographs show that the sign is not easily visible, especially from the street." Before she could continue, Judge Carter waved his hand dismissively. "That won't be necessary," he said, his tone growing colder. "The law is clear, and the driver is responsible for knowing the restrictions. I see no reason to reconsider the officer's judgment." Emily felt a pang of frustration but refused to show it. This wasn't about her. It was about the broader issue of how the justice system sometimes overlooked the finer details, the subtle forms of bias that could slip through unnoticed. But as she stood there, trying to maintain her composure, she realized something unsettling. Judge Carter, the man who had once been a student in her classroom, was now fully invested in the power of the bench. She had expected him to be different, fairer, more open-minded, but instead, he had become another cog in the machine of a system that often placed blind faith in its own authority. The exchange ended quickly, and the room returned to its usual hum. But for Emily, the moment lingered in the air like smoke. She wasn't just contesting a parking ticket anymore. She was watching a former student, someone she had mentored and shaped, lose sight of the very principles she had spent years trying to instill in him. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, but for Emily, the real battle had just begun. Emily Caldwell maintained her composure as she presented her case to Judge Carter. She knew this was a critical moment, not only for her own citation but also for the larger issue she was investigating: the systemic bias in how traffic tickets were issued and contested. She had gathered her evidence carefully. Photographs showing the parking sign in question, partially obscured by overgrown branches. As she laid out her argument, she remained calm, speaking with the precision and clarity that years of teaching constitutional law had instilled in her. "Your Honor," she began, "as you can see in these photographs, the sign indicating the parking restriction is partially blocked by overgrown branches, making it virtually unreadable from the road. I'm sure you can understand how a driver, approaching from the angle I did, might reasonably miss the restriction times." She paused, making sure every word resonated, before looking up to meet the judge's gaze. But instead of considering her evidence with the thoughtful attention she had expected, Carter's face was set in a tight expression, his eyes narrowed. He was not listening in the way she had hoped. Instead, he was ready to dismiss her argument altogether. "Professor Caldwell," Carter said, interrupting her with an abruptness that took her by surprise. "I've heard enough." He leaned forward, resting his hands firmly on the bench, his tone sharp. "The burden of knowing and obeying parking laws falls solely on the driver. I don't see how this obstruction in the sign changes that." Emily took a deep breath, keeping her voice even. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this isn't about the general responsibility of drivers. It's about fairness. I'm simply asking that the circumstances be considered. A small, easily missed sign doesn't provide clear enough warning to someone unfamiliar with the area." Carter's lips tightened into a thin line. His gaze flicked to the photographs for a moment before he quickly dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "You're making excuses," he said, his voice growing sharper. "The law is clear. If you were parked in a restricted zone, then you're liable, no matter how obscured the sign may have been." Emily held her ground, though she could feel the frustration beginning to build within her. It wasn't the first time she had faced a dismissive response from someone in power, but there was something about Carter's attitude that felt different. His impatience wasn't just a reaction to her case. It was as if he was irritated by the very suggestion that there might be a flaw in the system. The deeper she looked into his eyes, the more she realized that he wasn't considering her argument with fairness. He had already decided. As she glanced around the courtroom, the subtle dynamics of the room began to surface. She saw how different defendants were treated, and the distinctions were striking. Those who had familiar faces, regulars, perhaps, or lawyers with a reputation, were greeted with curt but respectful nods. Their cases were processed quickly, often without the judge so much as raising an eyebrow. But then there were the others, the ones who didn't fit the mold, the ones whose cases were scrutinized under a far harsher lens. It wasn't just Emily who had noticed this. The other defendants, all awaiting their turn, sat nervously in the same room. Some seemed to shrink under the judge's sharp gaze, while others, like Emily, seemed to challenge it, despite the growing tension in the air. There was a pattern, one that Emily could no longer ignore. The manner in which the judge interacted with different individuals seemed to be influenced by something other than the facts of the case. She had studied judicial bias for years, teaching her students the importance of self-awareness and the dangers of unconscious prejudice. But now, in this courtroom, she was seeing it play out in real time. Her years of experience studying the nuances of legal systems had made her acutely aware of how bias could manifest, often in ways that weren't overt or intentional. It wasn't always the blatant racism or sexism that made headlines. Sometimes, it was the more insidious forms of bias, the small, unnoticed ways that people in positions of power dismissed certain voices or treated some defendants with less empathy than others. As Emily continued to present her case, Carter's tone became colder, his responses more clipped. The subtle tension in the courtroom grew thicker. There was a clear divide between the way he engaged with her and the way he addressed others. Emily couldn't help but observe how her case was different from the others that had come before her. Most defendants were allowed to speak freely, even if their arguments were weak or unconvincing. But with her, every sentence seemed to be interrupted, every explanation cut short. "I've heard enough, Professor Caldwell," Carter repeated again, clearly annoyed. "The fine stands. Next case." The decision came down quickly, almost as if it had been predetermined. The courtroom was silent for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for her reaction. Emily felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had known, deep down, that she wouldn't win this case. But the way it had unfolded, so swiftly, so unfairly, struck her to the core. She gathered her things, her mind racing. The signs were there, plain as day. The judge's dismissive attitude, the way her evidence had been so casually disregarded, the way the law had been wielded with no sense of empathy or fairness. It wasn't just her case. It was a reflection of the system as a whole, a system that often failed to see the full picture. As she left the courtroom, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The tension in the air, the subtle yet undeniable bias she had witnessed, was only the beginning. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Judge Carter as he retreated to his chambers. He didn't pause to greet his clerks or discuss the case further with his colleagues. Instead, he moved swiftly, his steps echoing in the otherwise quiet hall, until he reached the sanctuary of his office. Inside, he closed the door behind him, allowing himself a moment of solitude. Carter sank into his leather chair, the cool air of the room a stark contrast to the heat of the courtroom. His hands were trembling slightly as he removed his robe and hung it on the back of his chair. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts. The image of Professor Emily Caldwell, standing there so calmly, refusing to back down, replayed in his mind. What was it about her that had unsettled him so? She had spoken with authority, her voice unwavering as she presented her evidence. Yet, he had dismissed her, not just her arguments, but her entire presence in the courtroom. He had interrupted her with irritation, brushed aside her photographs without even glancing at them, and imposed a fine 5 times the usual amount, despite her clear evidence of a reasonable mistake. He stood up and walked to the far side of the room, where a row of bookshelves lined the walls. His fingers traced the spines of various legal texts, but they stopped at the familiar, well-worn Westbrook yearbook on the middle shelf. Carter hesitated before pulling it from its place. The cover was faded, the edges frayed from years of handling, but it was the one object that connected him to his past. As he flipped through the pages, memories flooded back, memories of the young man he had been. There, in the section for the graduating class, was a photograph of Emily Caldwell, smiling proudly beside her fellow professors. Carter's eyes lingered on the picture, and for the first time, he allowed himself to really look at it. There was Emily, radiating the same energy that had drawn him to her all those years ago. Her lectures on constitutional law had been among the most challenging and eye-opening experiences of his education. She had taught him about justice, fairness, and, perhaps most importantly, about how easily prejudice could seep into a system that was meant to be impartial. His mind wandered back to those lessons. He could almost hear her voice in the lecture hall. Justice is blind, but we, as human beings, are not. It is our job as legal professionals to recognize our biases and work actively to overcome them. Carter had once admired those words, believed them. But today, as he reflected on his actions in the courtroom, he couldn't ignore the truth. He had allowed his bias to dictate his behavior. It wasn't just Emily's calm demeanor that had bothered him. It was the recognition, however subconscious, that he was no longer the eager student she had known. She was a professional, a woman who had earned her place in the legal community, and yet he had treated her differently, dismissing her arguments as if they were those of an ordinary defendant. His irritation had been disproportionate, and his decision to impose a fine far greater than usual had been a moment of reckless authority. He stared at the yearbook for a long time, his fingers tracing Emily's photograph. He could still hear her speaking in class, her lectures on unconscious bias resonating in his mind. But somewhere along the way, in his drive for efficiency and control, he had lost sight of those very principles. Instead of embodying fairness, he had succumbed to the belief that power should not be questioned. The shame settled into his chest like a heavy weight. How could he, of all people, have let this happen? His authority as a judge had clouded his judgment, just as Emily had taught him it could. He had allowed his role, his power, to overtake the very ideals he had once cherished. He walked over to his desk and opened the drawer where he kept the framed letter of recommendation Emily had written for him all those years ago. He hadn't looked at it in years, but today, it seemed to mock him. The words she had written in praise of his potential as a fair and just judge now felt like an indictment of his actions. Judge Carter is destined for great things. He has the intellect and the moral compass to shape the future of law. His commitment to fairness and justice is unwavering. The words rang in his ears, but now they felt hollow. Had he truly lived up to her expectations? Or had he become just another product of a system that was too often blinded by its own power? Carter sat back down, his head in his hands. The sound of his breath filled the room as he took a moment to steady himself. The weight of the realization that he had treated Emily unfairly, that he had failed to live up to the standards she had set for him, was almost too much to bear. He knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, not just in the courtroom, but within himself. But for now, all he could do was sit in silence, reflecting on the very lessons that had once shaped his career and that now seemed so distant. As the silence lingered, he found himself questioning the very foundation of his beliefs. Had he truly embraced the ideals of justice he had once admired? Or had he merely been wearing them like a mask, hiding the biases he had failed to recognize in himself? And what would Emily think of him now? The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders, and he knew that whatever came next, he would have to make things right, not just for the case at hand, but for the career he had worked so hard to build. As Judge Carter retreated into the solitude of his chambers, the tension in the courtroom did not dissipate. The usual buzz of legal proceedings continued, but beneath it, there was an undercurrent of murmured conversations, quiet exchanges, and knowing glances. It didn't take long for the regular court officers and attorneys to notice the unusual dynamics of the morning's session. One by one, the lawyers who had been waiting for their cases to be called shifted uneasily in their seats. They had seen many judges assert their authority, but the way Carter had treated Professor Caldwell struck a nerve. She was no ordinary defendant. Everyone in the room knew who she was. Emily Caldwell was a well-known figure in the legal world. a seasoned professor whose research on racial inequality in the justice system had shaped the perspectives of future legal professionals for years. To see her treated with such dismissiveness, especially when she had presented her case so calmly and logically, didn't sit well with those who had witnessed the proceedings. One of the attorneys, a middle-aged man named Alan, exchanged a glance with another colleague, Emily's former student, now a practicing lawyer. "Did you notice the way he handled her?" Alan whispered. He barely looked at the evidence. That wasn't normal. His colleague, a young woman with an air of concern, nodded. "I've seen him deal with difficult cases before, but this?" He practically dismissed her from the start. It was almost personal. The murmurs spread quickly, but not just among the attorneys. The court officers, who had spent years watching the comings and goings of defendants, also noticed the unusual treatment of Professor Caldwell. They exchanged looks of concern, unsure of how to interpret what they had just witnessed. Some of them, who had been working at the courthouse for years, had become accustomed to the ebb and flow of courtroom drama, but there was something about this moment that felt different. There was a palpable tension, a sense of injustice lingering in the air. But amidst the hushed whispers and glances exchanged, Emily remained utterly unshaken. She had been in enough courtrooms to recognize when the wheels of bias were turning. What had happened to her today was not new. She had experienced the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, manifestations of discrimination in the legal system for years. This moment, though it had been uncomfortable, wasn't a surprise. What mattered now was how she would handle it. Instead of reacting with frustration or anger, Emily maintained her composure. She had come to the courthouse not to seek confrontation, but to observe and document. She wasn't here for the drama. She had no intention of creating a scene or challenging the judge's authority. In her mind, this moment was simply another lesson, another instance to highlight the flaws in a system she had studied for decades. And more importantly, it was an opportunity to model how a professional should respond to injustice, not with impulsiveness or bitterness, but with grace and clarity. With practiced calm, she returned to her seat and pulled out a stack of student papers she had been grading. Her pen moved steadily across the pages, making notes and corrections. To any outside observer, it might have seemed like nothing more than a normal afternoon of grading. But to Emily, this was her way of letting the courtroom drama play out without getting swept up in it. She was teaching herself, even in this moment, the same lessons she had imparted to countless students over the years. Justice is not always immediate, and patience is often the key to uncovering deeper truths. As Emily worked, she was acutely aware of the people around her. The whispers, the glances, the uneasy shifting of bodies. But she kept her focus, blocking out the distractions, allowing the moment to serve as a living, breathing lesson in justice. She had once taught her students that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do in the face of bias or unfair treatment is to stay steady, to not react with anger but with calm assertion. And so she did. In the back of her mind, she wondered if perhaps this moment would serve as a wake-up call for Judge Carter. Would he recognize the error in his judgment? Or would his pride cloud his vision, causing him to double down on his decision? She didn't know. But what she did know was that her presence here today, whether in the capacity of a professor or a defendant, was not just about this particular case. It was about something bigger. The subtle ways in which the system perpetuates inequality and how individuals within that system can, at times unknowingly, contribute to it. As the minutes stretched on, the tension in the courtroom remained palpable. Emily had long since tuned out the quiet conversations around her, focusing instead on her grading. She had no intention of engaging with anyone, but she did take note of how the other defendants, many of whom were people of color, just like her, seemed to be observing the proceedings more closely. Their eyes were on her, watching how she handled herself in this moment of quiet conflict. It wasn't lost on her that her composure was serving as a subtle lesson for them too. This was the reality they faced in a system that often failed to see them as equal. In a way, Emily had become more than just a professor here today. She had become an example of how to maintain dignity and grace in the face of systemic injustice. The true power, she knew, lay not in the courtroom battles or the judgments passed, but in how one chose to respond when faced with the undeniable weight of discrimination. And for now, Emily would let this moment unfold as it would, knowing that the seeds of change were often planted in the quietest of ways. Judge Nathaniel Carter stood before the full-length mirror in his chambers, his eyes tracing the reflection staring back at him. The man in the glass was someone he didn't fully recognize, a stranger clothed in the black robes of authority, shoulders squared, and jaw set in the usual stern expression that had become second nature. He had spent years shaping his public persona as a strict but fair judge, one who was firm in his decisions, proud of his role in upholding the law. But now, standing there, he felt as if that confidence had been hollowed out, replaced with an overwhelming sense of self-doubt. His gaze dropped to the polished wood of his desk, where the Westbrook yearbook lay open to the page with Emily Caldwell's photograph. Her smiling face stared back at him, as vibrant as it had been years ago when he had been a young law student, soaking in her lectures on constitutional law. At the time, Carter had been captivated by her intellect, her passion for justice, and her ability to challenge students to think critically about their own biases. She had taught him, along with hundreds of others, about judicial temperament, fairness, and the danger of unconscious bias. But what had happened today? What had led him to behave so differently? In the courtroom, he had dismissed her evidence without a second thought, interrupted her in a way that was dismissive rather than respectful, and imposed a fine far beyond what was warranted. Why had he done that? The shame gnawed at him now, more profound than he had anticipated. It wasn't just the fine he had levied or the way he had treated Emily. It was the fact that he had allowed his own sense of authority, his own image of himself as a tough, no-nonsense judge, to cloud his judgment. In his desire to prove himself, to assert his power in front of the courtroom, he had forgotten the very principles Emily had instilled in him, principles that he had once admired in her and had sworn to carry forward in his career. As he stood there, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. Carter had always believed that the law was impartial, that his decisions were based purely on the facts before him. But today, he realized how easily the law could become tainted by personal biases, by assumptions that weren't based on the evidence. His treatment of Emily was a stark reminder of how these biases could manifest in the courtroom, even when one thought they were being objective. He reached for his collar and loosened it, suddenly feeling suffocated by the formality of his position. His hands, still trembling slightly, fumbled with the tie as he tried to steady himself. Carter had spent years building his career, positioning himself as a judge who was unyielding, who demanded respect from others. But today, the illusion of control had cracked. It wasn't just about his authority. It was about the integrity he had longed to protect. Taking a deep breath, Carter turned away from the mirror. He knew what he had to do next. He had to return to the courtroom, but it wouldn't be easy. The whispers in the hallways, the uneasy glances exchanged among his colleagues. He would face them all. But more than that, he would have to face Emily. She had given him the gift of wisdom all those years ago, and he had squandered it today. He owed her an apology, a moment of accountability. He picked up his robe from the chair and draped it over his shoulders with a sense of reverence he hadn't felt before. The mirror now reflected a man who was no longer entirely certain of his role, but who understood the importance of humility. Carter had prided himself on being a man of principle, but now, standing in that room, he realized how easy it had been to let that principle slip away. As the courthouse bell rang, signaling the end of the break, Judge Nathaniel Carter stood alone in the quiet of his chambers. His reflection still lingered in his mind, the face of a man who had lost his way. He had spent the last half hour in silence, considering every moment of the morning's hearing, every word spoken, every glance exchanged. The weight of his actions felt heavier now, suffocating him, as he stood at the threshold of a choice, either to continue in the same vein of authority and pride, or to humble himself, face the truth, and do what was right. He straightened his robe with a deliberative motion and walked to the courtroom. This time, his steps were slower, more measured, as though he was stepping into an entirely new space, both physically and emotionally. The man who had entered the courtroom that morning had been confident, almost too confident. Now, he was more conscious of the way his feet pressed against the floor, the way his breath came in measured pauses. It wasn't just his physical presence that had changed, it was his mindset. As he walked down the corridor leading to the courtroom, Carter thought about Emily Caldwell and the way she had responded to him. She hadn't fought back in anger or raised her voice in frustration. Instead, she had maintained her composure, almost as if she was allowing him to see his own mistakes without confronting him directly. There was a quiet strength in that, a patience that spoke volumes. As Carter pushed open the courtroom door, he was immediately aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The usual hum of activity seemed to quiet down just a bit. The clerks at their desks straightened. The murmurs from the attorneys at the back of the room faltered. Even the defendants, who had been anxiously awaiting their turn, seemed to sense that something was different today. Carter's eyes scanned the room as he entered. The usual faces were present: court officers, lawyers, and defendants, each of them entrenched in their own routines. But today, their expressions were different. There was an almost imperceptible pause, a hesitation, as if they were waiting to see what would happen next. Taking his seat at the bench, Carter looked at the file in front of him, the same case file from earlier, the one involving Emily Caldwell. The names on the paper blurred in front of his eyes, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to truly reflect on what this case represented. It wasn't just about parking violations or legal technicalities. It was about fairness, justice, and his responsibility as a judge to uphold those values without bias. He looked up, meeting the gaze of the clerk, who handed him the next case. For a brief moment, Carter hesitated. He had read the details, but now, the details seemed secondary. It wasn't the case that mattered. It was his approach to the case, to the people in front of him. He had to change, or else the work he had done all these years, everything he had taught, would mean nothing. "Call the next case," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. The proceedings continued, but now, something was different. When the first defendant approached the bench, a young woman in a suit who had been cited for a minor traffic violation, Carter looked at her with a new clarity. Instead of rushing to pass judgment, he took a moment to listen. He allowed the woman to speak, to explain the circumstances surrounding the violation. Her nervousness was palpable, but there was also a quiet relief when she realized that her voice was being heard, not rushed, not dismissed. Throughout the day, Carter found himself taking a similar approach with each new case. He was patient now, deliberate in his questioning, listening to the defendants with the same respect he had once reserved for his colleagues. He even found himself asking more thoughtful questions, questions that considered the context behind the violations rather than simply adhering to the rigid rules. In every case, there was a subtle shift. The room was quieter now, as if the air itself was waiting for Carter's next move. The attorneys, who had been exchanging wary glances earlier, began to notice the change. The usual tension that hung over the courtroom seemed to dissipate, replaced by an air of anticipation. For the first time in a long while, they weren't just watching a judge pass judgment. They were watching a man confront his own flaws, his own biases, and make a conscious decision to do better. As the final case of the day approached, Carter knew this was the moment that would define him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the weight of every eye in the room on him. He glanced at the defendant before him, a young man who had been caught up in a routine speeding violation, but who had a troubled past. The case wasn't complex, but the moment was. Instead of immediately delivering a sentence, Carter paused. He looked at the young man with a kind of understanding, as though seeing him not just as another defendant, but as a person whose circumstances, whose life, could not be distilled into a single infraction. Carter took a deep breath and addressed the defendant not with judgment, but with a sense of compassion. "This case is not just about the violation," Carter said, his voice calm. "It's about the larger context, your history, your struggles. We all have our moments, and I believe we can find a better way to move forward." The room seemed to hold its breath. Carter felt the weight of their gaze, but for the first time, he didn't feel the pressure of judgment. He felt the responsibility to get it right. As the young man nodded, Carter made his decision, one that was fair and compassionate, a decision that took into account more than just the letter of the law. And for the first time that day, Carter felt like the judge he was always meant to be. The courtroom was still. The usual noise, the rustling of papers, the The whispered conversations between lawyers, the shuffle of feet, seemed to have been swallowed by an unspoken tension. The air hung thick with expectation as Judge Carter made his way to the bench. His steps were deliberate, measured, each one echoing off the polished marble floors. This was not the same man who had walked in hours earlier, full of self-assurance, ready to assert his authority over the room. Now, there was a quiet humility in his stride. He paused just before taking his seat, looking out over the room. His gaze swept past the usual array of defendants, attorneys, and court officers, but it landed on one person in particular, Emily Caldwell. She was sitting near the back, as she had been before, her posture composed, her eyes focused on her work. The absence of any dramatic reaction from her was striking. It was as though she had known this moment was coming, or perhaps, in her own way, she had been waiting for it. With a soft exhale, Carter adjusted the microphone in front of him and turned toward the audience. The room had gone unusually silent, sensing the shift in his demeanor. He cleared his throat, and for the first time that day, his voice was steady, calm, without the forceful edge he typically wielded in the courtroom. "Before we continue with the proceedings," Carter began, his tone quieter than usual but firm, "I need to address something that occurred earlier today." He glanced briefly at Emily, then looked around at the people present in the room. His heart thudded in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and remorse swirling inside him. "As many of you have already seen, I mishandled a situation today. I did not conduct myself in a manner befitting a judge, and I did not treat a colleague with the respect she deserves." There was a pause, as if Carter was gathering his thoughts. It was not like him to show this kind of vulnerability, not like him to admit fault in such a public manner. But the weight of the realization, the truth of what he had done, pressed heavily on his conscience. "I treated Professor Caldwell unjustly," he continued, his voice unwavering, though his gaze dropped to his desk for a moment. "I dismissed her evidence, interrupted her when she was speaking, and imposed a fine that was not only unwarranted, but excessive. I allowed my authority to cloud my judgment and my actions, and for that, I deeply apologize." The room was still. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the regular attorneys who often seemed so comfortable in the courtroom appeared taken aback. The sudden honesty, the humility in Carter's words, was unexpected. It wasn't just an apology, it was a revelation. It was as though the walls Carter had built around himself had come down, and the man who stood before them was no longer just a judge, but a person, vulnerable and aware of his mistakes. Emily sat back in her chair, her hands still as she set her papers down in her lap. She hadn't expected this, at least, not in the way it had come. She had known that there was a lesson to be learned here, but the depth of it, the authenticity in Carter's words, struck her more than she could have anticipated. She had seen many moments of growth in her students over the years, but this was something different. It was a rare thing to witness a person not only recognize their flaws, but also stand before others and admit them openly. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Her silence was as powerful as his apology. She wasn't there to judge him, not in this moment. In fact, there was no judgment in her heart, only understanding. She knew that the road to personal growth was not always a smooth one. Sometimes it took a hard lesson, one that left scars, to open a person's eyes to the reality of their own actions. Carter continued, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than anyone else. "Professor Caldwell, you were right, and I was wrong. I let my pride get in the way of doing what was fair. I let my role as a judge define me more than my role as a human being." He looked up again, meeting her gaze directly. "I am sorry for how I treated you. You deserved better, and I failed you." The room remained silent. Emily nodded slowly, acknowledging his words, but it was clear that she wasn't looking for any grand gesture of redemption. What mattered was the sincerity of his apology, and in that moment, it was enough. She could see the change in him, the shift in his perspective. It wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about understanding the deeper implications of his behavior and recognizing the need for growth. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the clock ticking softly in the background. Then, slowly, Carter straightened up, as if the act of speaking his truth had lifted a weight from his shoulders. He took a deep breath and exhaled, the tension in his body dissipating, even if just a little. "I realize that an apology alone doesn't fix everything," he said, his voice now steady. "But I hope it's the first step in showing that I am committed to doing better, not just as a judge, but as a person." The room slowly began to stir. The air felt different now, less heavy, more hopeful. Emily didn't speak, but her presence was a quiet affirmation that, in this moment, something important had changed. It wasn't just Carter who had grown. It was the entire courtroom, witnessing a moment of humility and self-awareness that could shape them all. For everyone in that room, the lesson had been clear. Growth, redemption, and understanding came not through authority or punishment, but through acknowledgement, humility, and the willingness to change. The courtroom had returned to its usual rhythm, but for Judge Nathaniel Carter, the day's events had left an indelible mark. As the cases continued, he found himself lost in thought, reflecting on the unexpected turn his morning had taken. What had started as a simple traffic violation case had evolved into something far deeper, something far more significant. The lesson of the day had not come from the law books he so often relied upon, but from the quiet strength of a woman who had stood before him not as a litigant, but as a teacher. Carter sat in his chair, the weight of his responsibilities as a judge heavy on his shoulders, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought back to Emily's composed demeanor in the face of his harsh treatment. Despite his interruptions, his dismissals, and his unfair judgments, she had not reacted in anger or frustration. Instead, she had let him make his own mistakes, patiently waiting for him to see the truth. It was a moment of grace, something Carter had always admired in others, but had never quite understood until now. Emily's actions were a lesson in humility. She hadn't needed to force the issue or assert her intellectual superiority. She hadn't needed to argue or fight. Instead, she had embodied the very principle she had taught him all those years ago. The importance of fair and unbiased judgment, the value of listening, and the understanding that justice is not just about following the law, but about understanding the human element that comes with it. Carter's reflection was interrupted by the shuffle of papers as the next case was called. He glanced up, momentarily distracted, but then quickly turned his attention back to the task at hand. His thoughts remained focused on the lesson he had learned today, a lesson in self-awareness. He had always prided himself on being a fair judge, but now he realized how often he had failed to practice what he preached. His position of power had clouded his judgment, had made him dismiss evidence that didn't align with his preconceived notions. Emily's presence in the courtroom, her quiet but firm challenge to his authority, had forced him to confront the biases he had unknowingly held. But the lesson wasn't just about him. It was about the nature of justice itself. True justice, Carter now understood, wasn't about rigid rules and procedures. It was about understanding and recognizing the flaws in the system and working to correct them. It was about humility, about acknowledging that no one is immune to prejudice, and that fairness is something you must strive for every day, in every decision. As he continued with the cases, Carter's approach was different. He found himself listening more closely to the defendants, paying attention not just to the facts but to the human stories behind the cases. He asked more questions, allowed more time for responses, and when a defendant seemed nervous or unsure, he made a conscious effort to offer reassurance, rather than dismissive comments. His tone softened, and his judgments became more thoughtful. He had learned, in one fateful moment, that justice was not just about ruling in favor of the law. It was about ruling in favor of fairness, equity, and understanding. Emily, meanwhile, remained largely unnoticed by the other members of the courtroom. She continued her work, grading papers and reviewing notes with the same steady focus she had always maintained. But those who observed her, court officers, attorneys, even a few of the regular defendants, sensed that something had shifted. There was a quiet power in the way Emily carried herself, not seeking the limelight, not demanding attention, but subtly influencing those around her by the way she lived her truth. For Emily, this was not about personal vindication. She didn't need Carter's apology to feel validated. Her mission had always been bigger than that. She had dedicated her career to teaching the next generation of legal professionals the importance of true justice, the kind that isn't swayed by bias or power. Today, in some small way, she had helped someone see beyond their own blind spots. And for Emily, that was enough. It was all part of her quiet, ongoing work of creating a more just and empathetic world, one small lesson at a time. As the day wore on, Carter's decisions became more measured. He was no longer quick to dismiss defendants or their arguments. He thought twice before interrupting and made a conscious effort to ensure that every person in his courtroom had the opportunity to be heard. It was a small change, but a meaningful one. And in the quiet of the room, Emily continued with her work, content in the knowledge that her quiet influence had made a difference. She had done more than simply teach a lesson on the law. She had taught a lesson in humanity, one that would resonate not just with Carter, but with anyone who had been paying attention. Her commitment to true justice, the kind that transcends legal formalities and acknowledges the complexities of human experience, would continue to guide her as she shaped future generations of lawyers, judges, and citizens. In the end, it wasn't about the cases in front of them or the laws they had sworn to uphold. It was about the humanity that connected them all, the understanding that true justice isn't just about following the rules. It's about living the truth. And that, Carter realized, was the greatest lesson of all. As the gavel struck one final time, sealing the morning's proceedings, Judge Nathaniel Carter took a deep breath. His eyes lingered for a moment on the courtroom before he rose from the bench. The weight of the past few hours felt heavier than ever, yet there was a sense of clarity, of purpose, that he had never felt before. His earlier feelings of shame had transformed into something else, a quiet but undeniable resolve to be a better judge, a better person. For the first time, Carter walked out of the courtroom not as a man simply fulfilling his duties, but as someone who understood the true meaning of justice. He had always believed that justice was about following the rules, upholding the law, and maintaining order. But today, he had learned that justice was more than just a matter of legal precedent. It was about fairness, about understanding the complexities of human experience, and about the need to constantly check his own biases. His transformation wasn't complete. He knew. This was just the beginning. But the road ahead now seemed clearer, and for the first time in a long time, he was eager to walk it. In the days that followed, Carter began to reflect on his approach to judging. He revisited his past rulings, poring over cases where he may have been too quick to impose a penalty or dismiss a defendant's claims. He spoke with colleagues, seeking feedback on how he could improve his courtroom practices and how he could ensure that his decisions were always grounded in fairness and empathy. He revisited his old textbooks, rereading sections of constitutional law that focused not just on the technicalities of the law, but on the principles of equity and justice that lay at its heart. It was during these moments of introspection that Carter came to realize the depth of Emily's influence. What had seemed like a simple, mundane traffic violation case had become the turning point of his career. He owed her much more than an apology. He owed her the commitment to be the judge she had hoped he would become when he sat in her classroom years ago. But while Carter embarked on his personal journey of growth, Emily Caldwell continued her work, quietly but steadily. Her presence in the courtroom that day had not been about seeking recognition. She had no desire for the spotlight, no need for accolades or praise. Her work had always been about something much bigger: the pursuit of fairness, the eradication of systemic biases, and the teaching of future generations of legal professionals to see beyond their own preconceptions. Emily had always known that true change in the legal system would come not through dramatic moments of confrontation, but through the steady, consistent work of educating those who would one day shape the laws and practices that governed the country. She had spent decades teaching at Westbrook University, shaping the minds of law students who would go on to become judges, lawyers, and policymakers. She had seen firsthand how subtle prejudices could slip into the decisions made in the courtroom, how unconscious biases could shape the way the law was applied. But she had also seen how education, how a well-timed lesson or a carefully placed piece of evidence, could open someone's eyes to the deeper truths of justice. That was why she continued her work, despite the challenges. Emily knew that the fight for racial justice in the legal system was far from over, but she was undeterred. Every lecture she gave, every student she mentored, was a step forward. The impact of her work wasn't always immediately visible, but she knew it was there. rippling through the legal community. She had seen it in the way her former students had gone on to challenge the status quo, to push for reforms, and to advocate for marginalized communities in ways that were both powerful and quiet. Emily's journey, like Carter's, was far from finished. She had seen firsthand the resistance to change, the deeply ingrained attitudes that continued to perpetuate injustice. But she had also seen the possibility of transformation. She had witnessed it in the courtroom with Carter, and she saw it in her students every day. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always fast, but the road ahead was one she would continue to walk. As she sat at her desk that afternoon, grading papers and preparing her next lecture, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the events of the morning. Carter's apology had been a powerful moment, one that would stay with her for a long time. It had been a reminder that true change often begins with a single, humble acknowledgement of our mistakes. For Carter, that moment had been a turning point, a sign of his willingness to confront his biases and embrace the lessons of fairness and humility that she had always sought to teach. She smiled to herself, knowing that her work would continue, not just through the lessons she taught in the classroom, but in the way her students would one day affect change. They, too, would carry the torch of justice forward, each in their own way. And in doing so, they would create a future where justice was not a concept of rules alone, but one of compassion, understanding, and equity. The road ahead for both Emily and Carter was long, but they now walked it with a newfound purpose. And in the end, it was the journey itself, of learning, of growing, of striving for something greater, that would define them both. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey and listening to the entire story. I hope it resonated with you as much as it did with me. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on more inspiring and thought-provoking stories to come. Until next time.